The bed had been in my family for 112 years. I want you to understand that before anything else, because everything that happened afterward, the diplomatic incident, the emergency session of the United Earth Council, the 14-hour standoff that made every news channel on 6 planets, everything came down to that single fact. 112 years. My great-grandmother had that bed built by a carpenter in Lüneburg, Germany in the year 1939. Oak frame, hand-jointed pegs instead of nails, headboard carved with a pattern of wheat sheaves and morning glories. She'd slept in it through the war. My grandmother was born in it. My grandfather died in it peacefully at the age of 93, with my grandmother holding his hand and the morning light coming through the curtains. My mother brought it to America when she immigrated. My father proposed to her in that bed, well, beside it technically, because he was a man of some decorum, and he wasn't about to get down on one knee on a mattress. I was conceived in it, which I know because my mother told me with absolutely no embarrassment whatsoever in front of my 10th grade science teacher at a parent-teacher conference. I inherited it when my mother passed, and I brought it with me, all the way to Europa Station, because I was 58 years old and I had a bad back, and I knew exactly how that mattress needed to feel under my spine at 3 in the morning, when the station's gravity regulators cycled through their maintenance sequence, and everything shifted by 0.3% for 47 seconds. I had slept in that bed for 31 years. I was not going to stop sleeping in it because some alien diplomat had decided my quarters were the most convenient place to conduct interspecies negotiations. My name is Marcus Webb. I'm a civil engineer, specifically a hydrodynamic specialist, and I came to Europa Station 18 months ago to oversee the final phase of the Subsurface Ocean Access Project. We were building a network of bore shafts through 40 kilometers of ice to reach the liquid ocean beneath. And then we were going to drop pressure-sealed habitats into that ocean and begin the first genuinely underwater research facility in the history of humanity. It was important work. It was also, if I'm being honest, the kind of work that requires a great deal of patience, a great deal of precision, and a great deal of sitting in one place reading sensor readouts for 8 hours at a time. It was not glamorous. Nobody wrote news stories about hydrodynamic specialists unless something went catastrophically wrong. I was fine with that. I had my quarters, which were on the residential ring of the station's upper section, and I had my bed, and I had a small shelf of actual paper books because I'd been reading on paper since I was 7 years old, and I had no intention of changing now. And I had a coffee maker that I'd modified myself, because the standard issue ones produced something that tasted like hot brown water with delusions of grandeur. My quarters were, objectively speaking, not impressive. About 40 square meters. A sleeping area, a small living space, a bathroom the size of a generous closet, and a window that looked out over the surface of Europa, which was spectacular when Jupiter was visible and somewhat desolate when it wasn't. The bed took up most of the sleeping area. The books took up most of the wall space. The coffee maker sat on the counter like a small bronze altar to the god of functional mornings. I had made my peace with 40 square meters. Then 6 weeks ago, everything changed. The Velhari arrived in our solar system on a Tuesday. I remember this specifically because Tuesday was the day I did my laundry, and I was folding shirts when Station Commander Adiz Okonkwo's voice came over the all-stations announcement asking everyone to please remain calm, that the unscheduled vessels now on our long-range sensors were not a threat, and that we should all continue with our normal activities while she and her team assessed the situation. Continue with your normal activities is the kind of phrase that no human being has ever actually followed during a first contact scenario. Within 4 minutes, the common areas were packed with people staring at screens. Within 20 minutes, the Velhari had sent a transmission in 17 different human languages, including one that hadn't been spoken as a primary language in 400 years, and one that, as far as anyone could determine, didn't exist anywhere in recorded human history. Within 48 hours, we knew the basics. The Velhari were explorers and diplomats. They had been watching us for approximately 200 years, waiting, by their own account, for us to reach a sufficient level of dimensional sophistication before making contact. Europa Station, specifically, had triggered some threshold in their assessment criteria. Something about the combination of deep ice drilling technology and our particular approach to subsurface habitat pressurization had apparently impressed them. The irony of this was not lost on me. 40 years of diplomatic missions, orbital stations, generation ships, terraforming projects, and what finally convinced an alien civilization we were worth talking to was the way we'd solved a plumbing problem. Within a week, a Velhari diplomatic delegation was en route to Europa Station. Within 2 weeks they had arrived. And within 3 days of their arrival, I came back from my shift to find an alien sitting on my bed. She was taller than me by about 30 centimeters, which put her at just under 2 meters, with the characteristic elongated limbs and large, multifaceted eyes of the Velhari. Their appearance had been widely broadcast at this point, so I wasn't shocked by the physical reality of her. But I was extremely shocked by the physical reality of her location, which was on my mattress, with her long fingers spread across my grandmother's quilt, examining a loose thread with what appeared to be scientific interest. She was also, I noticed immediately, not alone. There were 2 others in the room with her, what I had learned to recognize as Velhari security personnel, taller even than her, standing near my bookshelf with expressions that I couldn't read, but that seemed to communicate a kind of professional alertness. One of them was examining my books. The other was examining my coffee maker. A human aide, young, nervous, with the look of someone who had already had a very long day and anticipated a longer night, was standing near the door, clutching a tablet. I stood in the doorway for a moment. Then I said very calmly, "Can I help you?" The aide startled badly. "Mr. Webb, I'm so sorry I left you 3 messages the system must have." "I was in the bore shafts," I said. "No signal." "Right, yes, of course. The situation is that Ambassador Vel Sarathka has indicated that she prefers these quarters for her diplomatic work, and the commander has." "She prefers them," I said. "Yes." "She prefers my quarters." "Yes." I looked at the ambassador. She had turned to look at me with those remarkable compound eyes, which gave her a field of vision that I'd read was something like 240 degrees. She made a sound that the translators rendered as a polite greeting, approximately equivalent to good evening, and then made another sound that the translators rendered as "this sleeping platform is acceptable." "I'm glad it meets with your approval," I said. "It's been in my family for 112 years." The translators rendered this. The ambassador's secondary eyes, the smaller ones, above and to the side of the primary pair, shifted in what I'd been told was a sign of interest. "How many generations?" her translator rendered. 4, I said. "My great-grandmother had it made by hand." Another sound from the ambassador. The translator rendered, "a ritual object." "Not exactly, it's where we sleep." "Yes," said the ambassador. "This is why I have selected it. Velhari diplomacy is conducted in spaces where humans rest. It is our custom. The resting space carries the," and here the translator struggled for a moment and produced, "the emotional weight of the inhabitant. It creates more honest negotiations." I looked at the aide. "Did anyone explain this to Commander Okonkwo?" "The commander has agreed to the ambassador's request," the aide said, in the tone of someone who knew exactly how that sentence was going to land. I looked back at the ambassador. She was watching me with what I was already learning to read as curiosity, a particular angle of the primary eyes, a slight forward lean. "Ambassador," I said, "I have a great deal of respect for your customs. I genuinely do. But this bed has slept 4 generations of my family, and I'd like to continue that tradition. Could we perhaps negotiate about the negotiations?" The aide made a small distressed sound. The ambassador, for the first time, made a sound that the translator rendered as something close to a laugh. Commander Adiz Okonkwo was a 52-year-old Nigerian-British astrophysicist who had run 3 deep space stations before Europa, and who had, in my 18 months at the station, struck me as one of the most genuinely unflappable people I had ever encountered. She had handled equipment failures, personnel crises, a near mutiny over the cafeteria's coffee policy, separate from my own coffee situation. This was a broader institutional problem, and the arrival of the first alien species humanity had ever made official contact with, all with the same measured, deliberate calm. She looked somewhat less calm when I sat down across from her desk. "Marcus," she said. "Commander," I said. "You had a conversation with Ambassador Vel Serethka." "I did." She found it. Okonkwo paused. Her aides described it as stimulating. The ambassador herself apparently spent 40 minutes discussing it with her delegation. "Good conversation," I said. "She's very sharp." Okonkwo rubbed her forehead with 2 fingers. "The protocol team is concerned. You may have created a diplomatic incident." "With respect, Commander, the incident was created when someone assigned my quarters as a diplomatic meeting space without telling me. That was an administrative failure, and I apologize for it." "Thank you. But the ambassador has formally requested that your quarters be used as the primary venue for the Phase 1 negotiations." "I understand." "And the ambassador has also," Okonkwo paused again, this time more significantly, "she has requested that you be present." I stopped. "Present during the negotiations," she says. Okonkwo looked down at her notes. "She says that the bed has told her about you, and she wants to hear the rest directly." There was a silence. "The bed told her about me," I said. "She means the emotional weight thing, the custom." Okonkwo set down her notes. "Marcus, I have to be honest with you. This is not how first contact was supposed to go. We have a full diplomatic team. We have linguists, xenopsychologists, protocol specialists. How many of them have slept in a bed that belonged to their great-grandmother?" She looked at me for a long moment. "None of them," she said. "Right," I said. "So when do we start?" The negotiations, if you could call them that in the early phases, were not what I had expected. I had expected formal sessions, delegates on opposite sides of a table, translators working in real time, the careful, stilted language of official diplomacy. Instead, what happened was that Ambassador Vel Serethka came to my quarters in the morning, when I was still drinking my first cup of coffee, and sat on the edge of my bed and talked. She asked me about the wheat sheaves on the headboard. I told her about my great-grandmother's farm in Lower Saxony, how the wheat harvest had defined the rhythm of the whole year, how the carving was a kind of prayer as much as a decoration. The ambassador was quiet for a long time after that. Then she said, through her translator, that Velhari negotiators traditionally spent the first 3 days of any diplomatic engagement simply learning to understand the other party as people before discussing anything of substance. "This is efficient," she added. "Negotiations that begin without this step take 3 times as long and fail 4 times as often." I said, "Did you have coffee on your world or something like it?" She made the almost laugh sound again. "We have a substance. It is, the translator says, fermented grain liquid, but this does not capture it." "Beer," I said. "That's basically beer." This word, beer. She tried it, the translator working in both directions now. We drink it when we are preparing for something difficult. Same, I said. Her secondary eyes shifted. What is the most difficult thing you have prepared for with this beer? I thought about it. My wife's funeral, I said. 8 years ago, she had something that started in her lungs and moved. My son and I sat up the night before with a bottle, and we didn't talk much, but we were both there, just there. The silence that followed was different from the previous ones, heavier. The ambassador's hands were very still on her knees. On our world, she said finally, we sit with the dying and we make sound. Not words, just presence in sound. Our young are frightened of silence. So are ours, I said. We just pretend we're not once we get old enough. Another silence, but this one felt like the right kind. Your son, said the ambassador, he lives. On Earth, he's a teacher, high school physics. I smiled. He wanted to come here. I told him someone had to stay home and keep things running. You said this because you worried. It wasn't a question, but I answered it anyway. Yeah, I worried. This is, she spoke to her aides in their own language, a flowing series of sounds that the translator didn't render, and one of them responded, and she turned back to me. The word we have for this. It means something like the particular courage of staying behind so another can go forward. It is considered very honored in our culture. I looked at my coffee cup for a moment. We don't really have a word for it, I said. We just call it being a parent. Ambassador Vel Sarathka made a sound that the translator didn't even attempt to render, but her aides both went very still, in a way that I was beginning to read as reverence. By day 3, I had stopped being surprised by her visits. By day 5, I had made her coffee. She hadn't liked it. The caffeine molecule did something uncomfortable to Velhari neurochemistry, apparently. But she had appreciated the gesture, and we had spent 45 minutes discussing the evolutionary reasons why humans and Velhari had both developed warm liquid morning rituals despite developing on planets in completely different solar systems. By day 7, I had met 4 other members of the Velhari delegation, all of whom seemed to view my quarters as some kind of important site. They were respectful, curious, and extremely interested in my books. The books were a source of ongoing fascination. The Velhari had digital records in abundance, but the concept of information encoded in physical marks on physical material, permanent, analog, unable to be altered or deleted, seemed to strike them as either primitive or profound, and they kept oscillating between the two interpretations. This book, said one of the junior delegates on day 8, holding up my battered copy of The Name of the Rose. These marks mean the same thing every time. Every time, I said. Same words, same order forever, as long as the paper survives. And if the paper does not survive, then someone might have written it down somewhere else, or they might not have. He was quiet. We lost things this way before our recording technology. So did we, I said. We lost languages, history, stories, music, all kinds of things. We've spent the last few centuries trying to figure out what we lost, and we can't, because by definition, if it's gone, we don't know what it was. He put the book down very carefully. This is why you keep them, he said, physical copies. This is why I keep them, I said. Other people have their reasons. Commander Okonkwo, who had begun sitting in on the sessions by day 5, caught my eye from across the room. She had the expression of someone watching something unexpected succeed. The formal negotiations began on day 12. I want to be clear. I was not the lead diplomat. I was not trained for this. I was a hydrodynamics engineer with good people skills and a bed that had apparently become the most important diplomatic venue in the history of human-alien contact. The actual diplomatic team, Dr. Yuki Tanaka, the lead xenolinguist, Ambassador Priya Vasquez of the United Earth Council, and a team of 6 specialists were all present, all prepared, all absolutely the right people for this work. But Ambassador Vel Sarathka had made it clear that she wanted me in the room. "You are the thread," she explained, to a mildly baffled Priya Vasquez on the morning of day 12. "In our culture, when we negotiate with a new people, we find a thread. One person who," and here the translator struggled again, and eventually produced something like, "who has shown us the texture of their people's lives, not the formal face, the actual texture." "And Marcus Webb is your thread," said Vasquez. "He would not move from his bed," said the ambassador, and her secondary eyes shifted in what I now recognized as amusement. "This is the first thing we learn about humans when we come to negotiate, and it is the correct first thing." Vasquez looked at me. I kept my expression neutral. "Could you elaborate on that?" Vasquez asked. "What does it tell you about humans?" "That they do not surrender what is theirs for convenience," said the ambassador. "That they hold to what their ancestors have given them. That they can say, without anger but with absolute certainty, 'This belongs to me and has always belonged to me and will continue to do so.' This is," she spoke again to her aides and the translator worked. "This is what we needed to know. A people who cannot hold their own ground cannot be trusted to hold agreements. And a people who would have given up the bed immediately, who would have smiled and nodded and said, 'Of course, take whatever you need.' This would tell us something different. Something more troubling." The room was quiet. "You were testing him," Vasquez said. "We were learning," said the ambassador. "Testing implies we controlled the outcome. We did not. Mr. Webb could have responded in many ways. He chose to negotiate. This is also important." I thought about that word, negotiate. I'd walked into my own quarters and found an alien on my grandmother's quilt, and my first instinct had been to ask if we could talk about it. Maybe that was just how I was wired. Maybe it was 40 years of working on projects where you couldn't afford to have two groups of engineers fighting about whose plan was right, because the ice didn't care, and the water didn't care, and the pressure certainly didn't care. Or maybe it was just that my mother had raised me to believe that most disagreements, examined closely enough, turned out to be misunderstandings about what each person actually needed. The substance of the negotiations would fill a much longer document than I intend to write here. There were three major areas: cultural exchange protocols, the establishment of a Velhari observation post in our system, and the broader question of what relationship humanity and the Velhari intended to have going forward. I contributed to exactly one of these areas in any meaningful way, and it was the third one, and the way I contributed was largely by answering questions. The Velhari wanted to understand humanity's relationship with its own history. This was, as best I could understand it, a crucial piece of the picture for them. They needed to know how a species related to its past in order to predict how it would behave in the future. Dr. Tanaka handled most of this with elegant expertise. But periodically, the ambassador would turn to me, away from the formal statements, away from the prepared documentation, and ask something small and specific. "The wheat sheaves on your sleeping platform, your great-grandmother carved them herself. A carpenter she knew, but she designed the pattern. She was alive when this carpenter made it." "Yes, she was about 20. "And you have slept in this platform since you were?" "Since I was about 7. My mother let me come into their bed when I had bad dreams. When she gave it to me, I was 27. 51 years, said the ambassador. "Give or take. And it has not deteriorated, the wooden structure. Oak doesn't deteriorate much if you take care of it. I've replaced the slats twice. The frame is original." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "When you sleep in it, do you think of them, the ones who slept in it before?" "Not consciously," I said, "but I think when I'm in it there's something, a sense of continuity, like I'm part of a longer story than just my own life." She looked at me for a long time. "This is the thing we did not expect," she said finally. "When we watched your transmissions, when we listened to your communications, We saw your technology, your expansion, your capability. We expected a species that had moved away from its past, but you carry it with you. We carry a lot of things with us, I said. Yes, she said. We are beginning to understand this. On the 19th day, something happened that was not on anyone's schedule. I was alone in my quarters. The sessions had ended for the day. The delegation had gone back to their ship for what their aides had described as a necessary period of collective reflection, and I was reading. My coffee was at the right temperature. Jupiter was visible through my window, enormous and amber-banded and indifferent. It was, as far as I was concerned, a perfect evening. I heard a sound at my door. It was the ambassador, alone, which I had never seen before. No aides, no security, no translators, just her and her own equipment, a small device at her throat that I recognized as an independent translation unit. "May I come in?" the translator said. "Of course," I said. She came in and stood for a moment, looking around the room, not the way she usually did with that precise, analyzing attention, but something softer, something more private. "I wanted to ask you something," she said. "That is not part of the formal negotiations." "All right." She moved to the window. Jupiter filled most of the lower half of the view. She looked at it for a while. She said, and the translator paused, working. The word would be closest to maternal parent. "She is ill. This is why I came on this mission and not the lead diplomat of our delegation, who would normally conduct a first contact of this significance." I set down my book. "She wanted me to see it," the ambassador continued. "The reaching. She said, when I was young, she told me that the most important thing about any people was whether they reached, whether they built toward things they would not live to see. She is ill now, and she will not see how this mission ends, and she wanted me to come here and see whether humans reach." And I said. She turned from the window. Her primary eyes found me, then the bed, then my shelf of books, then me again. "You drilled 40 kilometers through ice," she said, "to reach an ocean you have never seen, to build a home in it for your scientists, who will spend years there understanding things that will matter to people not yet born." She paused. "Your great-grandmother built a bed in a time of terrible danger on your world and made it beautiful anyway. With wheat and flowers." Another pause. "You carried it 40 light minutes from your home planet because the way it feels against your back at 3 in the morning is the right feeling." I didn't say anything. "She would have liked your world," said the ambassador. "My maternal parent." "I think I would have liked to meet her," I said. The ambassador made the almost laugh sound, but quieter this time and more complicated. "She would have argued with you. She argues with everyone." "I can work with that," I said. She looked at me for another long moment. Then she said, "Thank you for not moving from your bed." "It's a good bed," I said. "Yes," she said, "it is." "Good night, Marcus Webb." "Good night, Ambassador." The formal agreement, the Europa Accords, as they came to be called, was signed on day 27. It was a framework, not a full treaty. Nobody involved was naive enough to think that 27 days was sufficient to determine the entire future relationship between humanity and an alien civilization. What it established were channels, exchange protocols, communication frequencies, a set of principles for future engagement, and an agreement that the Velhari would maintain an observation post at the edge of our system, and that human representatives would be welcomed on the Velhari's nearest inhabited station. I attended the signing. I stood at the back of the room in my good jacket, the dark blue one I'd brought from Earth because you never knew when you were going to need a good jacket, and I watched Ambassador Vasquez and Ambassador Velserethka sign their names to a document in 2 languages, and I thought about my great-grandmother in her farmhouse in Lower Saxony, 20 years old, watching a carpenter cut the wheat sheaves into the headboard of the bed she would sleep in for the next 60 years. She couldn't have imagined this, Not in a million years. But she'd built something to last anyway, just in case. After the signing, there was a reception. I had a glass of something that wasn't quite champagne. The actual champagne was reserved for the formal delegation, and I was still, officially, a hydrodynamics engineer rather than a diplomat. And I stood near the window that looked out over Europa's surface and watched Jupiter do what Jupiter does, which is to say, exist enormously and not particularly care about anything we were doing. Commander Okonkwo found me there. "How are you feeling?" she asked. "Tired," I said. "Good, strange." "Strange how?" I thought about it. My job is figuring out how to move water through very complicated systems without breaking anything. Pressure differentials, stress tolerances, flow rates. It's very precise work. I looked at Jupiter. This was not precise work. "It was actually," said Okonkwo, "it was just precise in a different way." The ambassador told Vasquez that the most important thing I said in the whole 19 days was that I wasn't going to move from my bed, I said. 19 days of conversation, and what mattered was the very first thing. "Does that bother you?" "No," I said, and found that I meant it. I think she was right. Most of the time the first thing is the thing, everything else is just elaboration. Okonkwo was quiet for a moment. "The ambassador left you something," she said. "Before they departed, it's in your quarters." I looked at her. "She said to tell you it's not a ritual object," Okonkwo added, with a small smile. "Just something she wanted you to have." The something was a carving. It was about 20 centimeters long, made from a material I didn't recognize, not quite wood, not quite stone, but something in between, dark reddish-brown with a faint internal luminescence that pulsed very slowly, like a sleeping breath. The shape was abstract, but I could see in it what I thought might be leaves or waves, or the outline of something reaching upward. There was a note with it, translated into English in the ambassador's own translator-rendered handwriting. "For the bed, so it knows now what came after the wheat harvest. VSK." I stood in my quarters for a long time, holding it. Then I set it on the headboard, tucked into the corner where the wheat sheaves met the morning glories, and stood back to look at it. It fit, as if it had always belonged there. I sat down on the edge of my bed. Outside my window, Jupiter was setting below Europa's horizon, and the stars were coming out, not like stars on Earth, softened by atmosphere but sharp and cold and absolute, the way they are in space, each one a sun with its own planets and its own history and its own story that we had barely started to hear. I thought about my great-grandmother. I thought about my son, back on Earth, teaching high school kids why light bends and mass curves space. I thought about the ambassador's mother, who had wanted her daughter to come see if humans reached. We reach, I thought. Sometimes it works out and sometimes it doesn't, but we reach. We always reach. I got up and made myself a cup of coffee. Then I went to bed. There's a postscript to this. 6 months later, my son called me. His name is Daniel, he's 33, and he has his mother's eyes and my stubbornness, which is either a blessing or a curse depending on the day. "Dad," he said, "I've been following the news about the Velhari contact." "I know," I said. "I've been reading the transcripts, the parts that are public." A pause. "Dad, there's a transcript where Ambassador Vel Sarathkai talks about a human man who refused to move from his ancestral sleeping platform in front of an alien diplomatic delegation." Mai said. She describes him as, and I'm reading directly here, "a small, stubborn, coffee-dependent organism who understood more about what it means to carry your people with you than any official representative we encountered." "She's very kind," I said. "Dad." "Daniel." A longer pause. "Was it Grandma's bed? Is that what this is about?" "It's a very good bed," I said. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I want to come to Europa Station." "I know. I mean it this time. I put in for a teaching position at the station school. They're expanding the residential program. I submitted the application 3 weeks ago. I looked out my window. Jupiter was rising. I know, I said. I may have written them a reference letter. Another silence, longer. You could have just asked me, he said. You would have said no, I said. You would have said someone needed to stay home, like I told you. He laughed. It sounded exactly like his mother's laugh, the particular courage of staying behind. That's not our word, I said. That's theirs. Maybe we should borrow it. Yeah, I said, maybe we should. He came to Europa Station 4 months later. He brought 3 boxes of books and a terrible coffee maker that I immediately replaced with a better one. He had his mother's eyes. The first night he was here, I made dinner and we sat at my small table, and he looked around my quarters and then at the bed, and at the headboard, and at the little carving in the corner where the wheat met the morning glories. What is that? He said. A gift, I said, from the ambassador. She said the bed should know what came after the harvest. He looked at it for a long time. It's beautiful, he said. Yeah, I said, it is. Outside the window, the stars were coming out, sharp and cold and absolute the way they are in space, each one a sun with its own planets, each one the center of someone else's story, reaching out into the dark, hoping to be heard. We reach. We carry our people with us. We hold our ground when it matters, and we negotiate when we can, and we make coffee in the morning, and we sleep at night in beds that our grandmothers slept in. And when someone from the stars comes to sit on that bed and asks us what we're made of, we tell them the truth. And sometimes, not always, but sometimes it's enough. End. Word count, ~9 820 words. Estimated duration, minutes at 160 WPM. Narrator tone, warm, reflective, dry humor, quiet dignity. HFY elements, human stubbornness as virtue, ancestral connection. Emotional depth impressing alien culture. Human reach as civilization defining quality.